Welcome back to the Brittany Hughes Show, everyone. So the big story this week, obviously, being the Tyre Nichols video. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. I know that this is a few-day-old story. This is one that was kind of talked to death a bit over the weekend and into this week. If you have not seen the video itself, my recommendation is that you simply read about it. You don't watch it. I think enough has been written about it that we don't necessarily need to go over or expose ourselves in excruciating detail to what happened to this man. I understand why this is an important video. I understand why it's important to understand what happened. We're going to talk about that as we go on in this episode a little bit. At the same time, I do think that in some cases, especially when the details are already out there, it becomes a little bit gratuitous to continue to watch something like this, which is why I'm not going to show it to you here. If that's something you haven't seen, of course, you can find it all over social media, all over the internet. And it's been a really interesting story to watch over the past few days, how the media has continued to try to fan the flames of this story, even though the narrative has kind of fallen apart and they're not getting what they want out of it. And on top of the video itself, the media reaction to this has been incredibly sick. I think that when the story first broke, of course, we did not necessarily know right off the bat that this was a black man who had been killed at the hands of black police officers. All we knew was that this was yet another black man who had been killed by police officers, and I think many in the media got excited because the assumption, whether they realized it or not, their assumption was that there was at least one white guy in the mix. And of course, this was going to be another run-of-the-mill police brutality story. And you can blame everything on white people and white supremacy and racism and all of that because apparently the media just really love to see our cities burn. And of course, that's exactly what would have happened if this story had gone according to their narrative. When that didn't happen, however, when it turned out that the 5 police officers who killed this young man were in fact black themselves, all 5 to a man. There was not a single white person involved in this entire incident. So when that happened, there was some wind that sort of got taken out of the sails of the media narrative. Now, of course, they still had to run with this story because so much had been made out of it already, and they tried to spin it, and it's still, you can still find stories about it, but of course, if you look on CNN's website, if you look on NBC's website, this is a story that's now been pushed far below the major headlines, not being treated like the George Floyd incident, which again, if you look at the 2 videos, and I'm not saying that what happened to George Floyd was a good thing, but I think that the circumstances that led to these 2 incidents and the way that these 2 men were treated and what kind of led up to the issue at hand and what resulted in these 2 men's deaths were very different. And I would arguably say, and I think most people would, the Tyre Nichols video is a far more grotesque and brutal scene. I think that it was even less excusable. And I think that if there were ever a time for, protests, which again, I'm not calling Black Lives Matter riots protests. They're not. They're violent riots, and there's never a good time for those. But if there was going to be a reaction to police brutality or police reform, you would think that it would have happened over this video as opposed to what we saw in the case of George Floyd. But in fact, what we have is the opposite. Now we've got a story that's being buried below the major headlines. This isn't something that has been kept going. It's something that a lot of leftists are still talking about, but you don't see the massive riots in the streets. You don't see Black Lives Matter completely up in arms. You haven't gotten the visceral reaction from the left, and it's because this story doesn't fit a racial narrative. It's interesting how a lot of the wind gets taken out of the sails here, so to speak, when there's not a racial bias element to be found, or at least not one to be inventive. Again, I'm not saying that Derek Chauvin was not guilty in the case of George Floyd, but we never actually established that there was a racial component to that case other than the fact that he was white and George Floyd was black. We never established that there was a racial bias in his reaction rather than just simply bad judgment in that moment. But that was the case that was made, right? That was the claim that was made. But when you couldn't make that case in the story of Tyre Nichols, when it turned out that all of the officers involved were black, all of a sudden that story just got completely taken out of the headlines. And it's still being talked about, but I think what you see is the left grappling with how do we spin something out of this now? Because this is not a cut and dry cookie cutter police brutality, white guy versus black victim story like they wanted it to be. And the New York Times even admitted this. I thought this was an interesting way of putting it, whether they meant to admit it or not, in an article this week entitled Tyre Nichols Beating Opens a Complex Conversation on Race and Policing. The 5 officers charged with the murder of the young black man are also black, complicating the anguish and efforts at police reform. So I have a question. Why does that complicate anything? If your actual goal was police reform, if your actual gripe was with police brutality and police abuse of power against somebody who ended up losing their lives at the hands of gung-ho cops who didn't pull back or who maybe overreacted, if that was your actual complaint, it wouldn't matter what the race of the person was who died or was abused at the hands of the cops and the race of the cop themselves. That wouldn't even be that would be a non-starter. That wouldn't be an issue. But the fact that the New York Times is straight up admitting that the race of the officers involved in this incident complicate this means that it doesn't fit the narrative that they were looking for. They want, and I'm pun intending here, they want a black and white issue. They want a cookie cutter white cop versus black victim narrative. They like to paint this picture, and this is the way that they treat everybody. This is the way that they treat everybody pretty much across the board, no matter what issue. Pick an issue, and I will show you how the left likes to group people into these classes, right? All black people are the same, all white people are the same, all women are the same, all Latinos are the same. These homogenous groups that they like to put us all in to play these identity politic games and pit us against one another and try to group people into classes to make it sound like these people are always the perpetrators and these people are always the victims. They do it every single time. And because this didn't fit into that nice little box that they've constructed that they like to use as a political weapon, all of a sudden the situation is complicated by the race of these police officers. And I think that that's actually true in the way that the left looks at this. This has complicated things for them. Because now they have to try to spin something out of this story that didn't just naturally come up, right? I think that they're actually a little bit bummed that this did not spark the kind of protests, or as we like to call them over here in reality, riots, that the George Floyd case did. I think that they like that. I think that they like ginning up violence and hatred. They like fueling that fire, and this didn't do it. So, this has sort of divided the left into 2 camps. The first camp is still trying to spin this story into some sort of a white supremacy angle. They're still going with that riff because it's the only thing they know how to do. If they don't have that, they don't have anything. So they've got to find some way to make that work. Tim Wise, who's a white man, by the way, and a racism educator and an author, tweeted, quote, "Anyone who says the killing of Tyre Nichols can't be about racism because the cops were also black really doesn't understand how white supremacy or anti-blackness work." So apparently, just because all of the cops were black, that still makes them white supremacists, or at least beholden to white supremacy. The cognitive dissonance in this is absolutely amazing. Congressman Cori Bush said in an official statement, this is an elected official, said in an official statement, quote, "Merely diversifying police forces will never address the violent racist architecture that underpins our entire criminal legal system. The mere presence of black officers does not stop policing from being a tool of white supremacy." So again, in her spinning of this, anytime a police officer of any race or any gender or any creed or whatever, anytime a police officer exerts an abuse of power over someone, That is automatically white supremacy because the entire system is white supremacy. So you're going to blame everything on white supremacy no matter what. You're never going to take a hard look at the nuance of the situation. You're never going to say, well, maybe there was something else at play here. No, automatically white supremacy because, again, white people and white culture and historical white supremacy and the invisible neo-Nazis that are somehow pervading all of our country, even though we can't actually see them anywhere because there's like 4 of them. All of this is the real problem. And it doesn't actually matter who's perpetrating the violence. We are going to blame it automatically on white supremacy. Jamel Hill claimed, I need so many people to understand this regarding Tyre Nichols. The entire system of policing is based on white supremacist violence. Again, whole police system. Doesn't matter that in some places like LA, 50% of the police force is Hispanic. Whites actually make up a minority of police officers in many locations, but it doesn't matter. We're automatically going to brand the entire thing white supremacy. And just for funsies, this isn't just pundits who want to try to get a whole bunch of clicks from their lemming following that are saying this. Here's a crazy white woman over on TikTok saying that white people should blame themselves for Nichols' death. Check this out.
I got a message today for some white people. If we have white people listening, paying attention, I wouldn't mind if you would do this with me. We rub our chests, we find our heartbeat, and we say, we did this. We did this. White supremacy did this. I'm talking about Tyre Nichols. The police didn't do this. The Memphis Police Department didn't do this. White supremacy did this.
Okay. So real quick here, 2 points. First of all, if you don't want to sound like a complete and total moron like that lady, first make sure that you are not paying too much for health insurance that you don't need and that subsidizes things that you don't care about. So real quick, I am partnering with Share Healthcare to let people know about their Christian-based alternative to traditional health insurance. So Share Healthcare is not health insurance. Share Healthcare is a cost-sharing program between people who do not want to pay exorbitant healthcare premiums for coverage that they don't need or who don't want to subsidize medical costs for things that do not align with their faith-based values. So with healthcare programs that start as low as $149 a month, Share Healthcare provides Americans with medical, financial, and religious freedom by offering share cost plans that align with their Christian values. So if you think that a cost-sharing plan might be beneficial for you and your family, head on over to sharehealthcare.com, use the referral code MRCTV23, that's sharehealthcare.com, MRCTV23, and find a share cost plan that is right for you. Secondly, the fact that liberals are still trying to make this a story and still trying to push so hard for this white supremacy angle, even though nobody in this incident was actually white. They're still trying to blame white people and white supremacy for the death of Tyre Nichols. I think that this shows not only their absolute hatred for the truth and their addiction to their own narrative, no matter what, and their complete inability to be introspective and to question whether maybe or not the structure that they have constructed in their heads might not be accurate. But it also shows just how far they're willing to go to gaslight and lie to people, to try to perpetuate this sense of victimhood. This takes aim at a cornerstone of their ideology and their policies. That's why they have to continue to bang this drum even when it's so obvious that it doesn't work. They cannot lose this ground. They have to keep Black communities entrenched in a sense of perpetual victimhood. So much of their ideology and the policies that they build on it depends on this. If they lose that ground, they lose everything. Think about it. Every single foundational structure that they have, whether it's welfare, and big government programs, to their stance on education and government-run institutions, to things like climate change that they are now trying to attach at every point to this idea of systemic racism, every single agenda item on their list traces back to the common denominator of perpetual victimhood among minorities, particularly the Black community. Every single time. So they have to make this work. They have to make Black people believe that somehow, some way, this is another example of how they have been victimized by a white supremacist structure. And if they have to take these 5 Black police officers and try to paint them as a cog in a white supremacist machine, they're going to do that. Now, that brings me to the second camp of liberals that I think has kind of come out of all of this. So you've got the ones that are desperately trying to tie all of this to white supremacy. And then you've got another camp that I think has realized that that's probably not going to fly here in this particular case. That might be a stretch. Either that or that's just not the tack that they're going to take because it's the harder case to make. So they're going to go with the lower hanging fruit here and use this to paint all police officers as bad, whether they are part of a white supremacist structure or not. Now this is about all police are racist against Black people because there is a profiling, stereotyping issue going on, and Black people are disproportionately brutalized by police. Unfortunately for them, the statistics do not bear that out. Not if you look at the totality of what's going on here rather than just cherry picking your data, which is exactly what they like to do. So Joy Reid, for example, says that the story and the death of Tyre Nichols at the hands of police officers is, quote, as American as apple pie. Here she is.
Now, if you have a heart, what happened to the 29-year-old father, skateboarder, FedEx driver, and amateur photographer should outrage you. It should shock and disgust you, as should the so-called brothers who chose to behave like a little blue gang rather than as Black men. But it damn sure shouldn't surprise you. What happened to Tyre Nichols was as American as apple pie. 404 years later, the United States is still a land of subjects and citizens. I mean, it's more subtle, of course, but the basic structure is still the same. White Americans, unless you are poor or disabled, enjoy the full benefits of citizenship. You can generally vote without impediment, as long as you're not a woke student who prefers the convenience of a Dropbox. Your family has never faced violent reprisals for trying to go to school or to work. You can live wherever you want without fear of reprisal, rejection, redlining, artificially reduced property values, or your neighbors calling 911 because they don't believe you live there. Historically, America's citizens have felt free to lynch, to riot numerous times from Reconstruction through the 1930s, all the way up to January 6, 2021. They have felt entitled to overthrow the government when they don't like the outcome of an election. As a citizen, the police generally serve and protect you, your property, and your social comfort. Citizens feel free to scream at the police when they're pulled over, or even to swing their fists at them. They get fed by the police after they gun down a church full of worshipers. They calmly surrender after committing a massacre. But those in this country who are still treated as subjects, Black folks, regardless of wealth or status, brown folks, AAPI Americans, poor white folks, non-white immigrants, and others who live at the margins of citizenship, live with the constant risk of housing and job discrimination based on your race, your social status, your hairstyle, or your last name. Higher interest rates and inadequate services in the zip codes you somehow always seem to get routed to. You might face discrimination at the airport and extra surveillance based on the outward manifestation of your religion. And then there is the often rude, dismissive, cruel, and too often brutal and sometimes deadly policing, which again was designed to control you and keep you socially confined to a status of inferiority and fear, regardless of how fervently you comply, how high you raise your hands, or how much you scream or beg or cry out for your mom.
I agree that Black on Black violence is about as American as apple pie. Unfortunately, in many communities, that's fairly common. But I think what Reid means here is that police brutality against Black people is normal, or at least has been accepted as normal in American culture. Of course, she's incredibly wrong. There have been many, many stories of white men who've been abused and killed at the hands of police and police brutality. Tony Tampa, Daniel Shaver, Martin Gugino, all of those, you can look up all of those names. Those are just a few examples. But the truth is that out of the millions of police interactions that ordinary people have with the some 800,000 law enforcement officers we have in this country every single day, the number of violent and deadly interactions are a relative few, and incidents of police abuse and brutality are an even smaller proportion of those. Statistically speaking, this is kind of like the idea of mass shootings. Is it a problem when it happens? Absolutely. Should we take a look at it when it happens? Absolutely. Should it be dealt with when it happens? Should we take steps to figure out if there's something that we can do to try to limit it? Absolutely. But the left likes to take these things and make it sound like there's a devil in every single shadow. And like this is something that's just happening perpetually all the time, every single day, constantly, that this is an endemic. Bad cops absolutely exist. I guarantee you that the people that want to see bad cops held accountable the most are good cops, because it gives them a bad name and it makes their job even harder to do. But bad cops, by and large, are not an endemic, nor are police officers disproportionately targeting Black people. And you can see this. So critics like to claim that Blacks are disproportionately targeted and killed by police because of this statistic. Black Americans only comprise about 13%, actually a little bit less, of the entire population. However, they make up about 27% of those who are shot by police. By that standard, it would make it sound like Black people are at a much more likely rate of being shot by police. And when you listen to that narrative, when you listen to that soundbite, oftentimes the first thing that you have to note is that the left does not like to admit that that includes armed people as well. So when we're talking about all of the people, the 1,000+ people that were shot and killed by police in 2022, the vast majority of them were armed and or threatening at the time that it happened. The vast majority. So oftentimes when you have a situation like that, that is something that is being perpetrated by the criminal themselves. So first of all, let's go ahead and clear that up. We're not talking about, the 27% of all of the people that were shot by police were unarmed, innocent Black men who were crying out for their mamas. That's not what we're talking about here. But if you just listen to that, even taking into account all of the people that were armed and dangerous at the time that they were shot, if you listen to that, critics will make the claim, and social justice warriors will make the claim, that Black people are twice as likely to be shot and killed as white people based on those numbers. NBC News reported in 2022, and this is how they frame it. This is exactly how they frame it, leaving out lots of little data points. According to data collected by the Washington Post, police shot and killed at least 1,055 people nationwide last year, the most since the newspaper began tracking fatal shootings by officers in 2015. That is more than the 1,021 shootings in 2020 and the 999 in 2019. Black people, who account for 13% of the U.S. population, accounted for 27% of those fatally shot and killed by police in 2021. That means Black people are twice as likely as white people to be shot and killed by police officers. First of all, that's not exactly how statistics work, because there are minorities other than Black people in this country that kind of throw off that data. White people, numerically speaking, are still shot and killed by police at a far higher rate than any other ethnicity. But even if we go with that, even if we go with that line that Black people are twice as likely to be as white people to be shot and killed by police officers, here's the little tidbit that leftist media outlets do not like to point out. Black people also, as a community, commit a disproportionate number of violent crimes. 33%, as a matter of fact. 33% of all violent crimes in this country are committed by Black people. Now, I really, really hate these sort of general bucket descriptions because Black Americans are not a homogenous group, just as white Americans are not a homogenous group. There are so many good, law-abiding Black people, and there are a whole bunch of really crappy, trashy white people. But the left likes to put this in these terms, right? In these percentages, like none of the other variables, like location or social status or dependency on government programs or whatever, none of that actually matters, right? We're only going to look at the race of the person. So by that token, if you want to understand why police are even there in the first place, let's look at the fact that 33% of violent crimes in this country are committed by people of an ethnicity that only make up about 13% of the entire population. That means that Black people commit a higher rate of crimes than Black people that are actually shot and killed by police. When you compare those two percentages, that is a necessary part of the story, because what it means is the bottom line is the police go where the crimes are. This is not rocket science. If you took out the racial element of this and you simply looked at the communities where the police are, where the crime is, and where so many of these violent altercations end up taking place, even if you took race out of the whole entire thing and you just looked at a map, it would make perfect sense to anybody looking at it. The police go where the crimes are. And the community whose members are twice as likely to commit violent crimes are more likely to be engaged in violent crime when they are approached by the police. That's not racism. That's not a commentary on whether or not it's something about a person's skin color that makes them more likely or is a motivator for criminal behavior. That's absolutely ridiculous. There's nothing about the amount of melanin in a person's epidermis that makes them more likely to commit crimes. That has a lot more to do with social structure, and we're going to get to that in a second. But this is just simply statistics, and those statistics absolutely lead to profiling. If you're a police officer in a certain neighborhood, you can bet that you're probably going to be keeping an eye out for a certain kind of individual. Same would be true, by the way, if you're in an opium den in West Virginia where there's not a Black person in sight, but you know who you're dealing with and you know who the criminal element in that community are. Same exact thing. And these statistics lead to greater police presence in certain communities, and that's more likely to lead to encounters with the cops, which are disproportionately more likely to end in violence in those communities because there's a disproportionate police presence. That's just the way that it works. And when police, by the way, are removed, whether that's from orders or budget cuts or defund the police movements, when police are removed from those communities, the people that are most likely to suffer from the lack of police presence are the people in those communities who are now left to the hands of the criminal element. It happens every single time.
We begin with pleas for help. Business owners and residents living in fear as an increase in violent crimes grips their neighborhood.
Police officers are holding back on some enforcement efforts after weeks of protests. This as violence is skyrocketing with some innocent victims caught in the crossfire.
When they disbanded that unit, the gun unit, all this stuff, poof, because the city was doing all right.
Gun violence is on the rise in New York City. No community or age group seems to be immune.
Children caught in the crossfire of rising gun violence across New York City. A 1-year-old has died after being hit by bullets.
He was just learning how to talk. And some cowards took his life.
The grandmother of 1-year-old DeVell Gardner Jr. stood outside the Bed-Stuy Park Tuesday, where her grandson was fatally shot in his stroller.
The breaking news in Brooklyn, police are reporting 4 shootings in just over an hour, 6 total for yesterday. That included an 11-year-old boy who was shot while playing outside his own home.
Gun violence erupts in the city once again, not far from where a 1-year-old was shot and killed on Sunday night.
Last night, 6 people were shot in Brooklyn in just 1 hour.
It is horrible to watch a father holding his daughter's hand in broad daylight when a car pulls up. The gunman reaches out of the passenger side window and opens fire. The little 4-year-old can be seen running for her life.
It should not be going on, period, especially kids, and it happened in broad daylight. It's crazy.
When is it going to stop? How many more lives have to be lost? How many mothers have to keep burying their kids?
We had one female, 23 years old, that was shot 4 times in the chest. 10 minutes later, at 6:31, 2105 Rockaway Parkway, we had 3 males shot.
Just a short distance away in a building on East 171st Street, a double murder. Watch as 3 men cower as the gunmen start shooting. 2 men in their 20s killed.
Police say 2 people were shot at a block party on Frost Avenue. Detectives say a woman was hit in the head. We've learned she's in critical condition. Also, a man shot. He's expected likely to survive.
Breaking news on this Sunday night. 9 victims fatally shot tonight across 4 boroughs in a recent surge of violence in New York City.
It's been a violent weekend in New York City with more than 22 people shot so far. Surveillance video recorded an incident in which a gunman walked up and killed a 35-year-old man who was washing a car.
17 shootings occurred and 24 people were injured in the last 24 hours here.
You can see the suspect walk up to a man last night on New Lots Avenue, pull out a gun, and start firing as people scatter.
A teenager from Queens is just the latest victim. Since last Friday, more than 60 people have been shot. 11 have died.
The gunman then turned and walked away. This happened last night on New Lots Avenue. A 20-year-old man fatally shot in the head. A 36-year-old woman is recovering from gunshots to her arm and torso. So far, no arrests.
Community activist Tony Herbert is calling on Mayor Bill de Blasio to redeploy the NYPD's undercover anti-crime unit, largely tasked with getting guns off the street. The unit was disbanded last month amid protests against police brutality.
Now, why, if not race, why do these communities continue to have these problems? Leftist policies are the things that are driving the vast majority of social ills in urban minority communities. Conservatives like me continue to push for 2 things pretty much above all else. If you can solve these 2 issues, if you can tackle these 2 issues, just about everything else lines up like dominoes. The 2 things that conservatives like me continue to push for are a return to the importance of fathers in the home. Because if you look at a home with a strong father, that alone increases the likelihood that a kid gets good grades in school, decreases their likelihood of turning to drugs or alcohol or violent crime, increases the likelihood that they go on to raise strong families of their own. If you put a strong father in a home, it solves just about every single childhood problem you can think of. It vastly increases a child's likelihood to not live in poverty when they become an adult. So fatherlessness in homes is the one thing that we want to address. The second is school access, school choice, taking children in urban communities out of failing government institutions and putting them in places where they can thrive. And it is those 2 issues that the left absolutely hates. The left cannot stand the idea of strong families. They attack it at every single turn. It's why they promote things like abortion. It's why they promote things like government programs and welfare. The only thing that you need is welfare, Planned Parenthood, and Uncle Sam. Those are the 3 things that you need, according to a leftist. You don't need a strong father, and it's the same exact mantra that Black Lives Matter has adopted. We don't need that white supremacist, white culture, Western civilization construct of a family. We don't need dads in homes. Well, how far has that gotten you? And it's the same exact thing when it comes to education. Leftists absolutely cannot stand the idea of school choice, of a taxpayer being able to take their tax dollars and put their child in a school that won't fail them. Leftists want every single child, including urban minority children, to be shoved into failing government institutions so that they can be brainwashed by the liberal agenda, indoctrinated, and turned out into society toting the leftist line at the behest of big government. Every single time. And those are I think the 2 biggest things that are impacting Black communities in these cities. And it's what's creating this issue. And when you have the residual problem of an increased police presence because you have an increased police crime, and then you have an increased number of incidents and run-ins with police that end in violence and death, all of a sudden it's police problem, and all of a sudden it's white supremacy. No, we have a problem in urban communities when looking at the totality of this. Now, clearly, in the case of Tyre Nichols, the cops were absolutely wrong. It doesn't take anything more than watching that video one time to definitively state that the cops were wrong. And what we're seeing here is the justice system working. We're seeing the justice system working. The police officers were immediately disciplined. They're now being put through the justice system. This is something that I think is actually a really good indicator of cops being held accountable for their actions. This is not a situation where police officers were just simply allowed to do whatever they wanted and then let off. The justice system is working in this case. And I do think that when you look at this particular story, I think that we can say that maybe there's some steps that could be implemented, that some steps could be taken in improving policing. I think that ensuring that psych evals are not ignored is something that's very important. We've seen that happen on several different occasions, whether it was a white person that ended up suffering or a black person that ended up suffering. Regardless, there are certain police officers that shouldn't be on the streets. And we have seen some of those officers and their paperwork sort of fall through the cracks and they end up in places that they shouldn't be. I think that looking at how officers that have been fired by a police department for cause for certain offenses end up turning around just to get hired by another police department is something that we could absolutely be looking at. I think that it's always important to look at how we train police officers and making sure that they are ready and making sure that they are equipped and prepared to deal with all of the situations that they have to come into contact with every day. I think that all of those questions are 100% worth asking. But to use this incident to claim that police officers, by and large, are intentionally and disproportionately targeting black people, and that that's somehow a symbol of white supremacy and a white supremacist structure in this country is absolutely ridiculous. You could make that case if black people in urban communities, particularly because that's where you see the vast majority of these problems arise. You could make that case if black people were committing a disproportionate number of crimes. If the number of crimes that their community was committing, by and large, again, if you want to start putting people into these baskets, like we have to talk about them as one big group, if the number of violent crimes and the number of incidents that required a police response in minority communities were statistically equal to or even lower than their percentage of the population, when it was clear that this is a community that is not a threat to one another primarily, but they were still being disproportionately shot and killed by police, then you could make that connection. Then you could say, clearly, we've got a disparity here. You've got a community that is predominantly peaceful, but is bearing the brunt of police action. Then you could make that case. But that's not what's happening. As a matter of fact, the statistics bear out that the percentage of black people being fatally shot by police is pretty proportionate to the percentage of violent crimes that are being committed by this one ethnic subset. That's statistics. The only people that should be offended by that are people that hate the truth or people that have a phobia of numbers. And I think we know which the left is. That's just simply the way that it is. I think that the Tyre Nichols story, as we watch that unfold, as we watch justice unfold, as we watch the justice system work, is obviously something that we want to stay on top of. But again, the media narrative, the Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, we've got to blame everything on white supremacy and all cops are bad and we should defund them. The only thing that you are going to do is hurt minority communities, which you're already doing by the policies that perpetuate the problems that end up with this mess. That's what this all stems back to, not some fictitious white supremacy nonsense. And with that, that's the Brittany Hughes Show for today. Thank you for joining me. Again, sharehealthcare.com, MRCTV 23 is the referral code there if you want to check out their share cost plans instead of traditional health insurance. Also, make sure, if you have not already, and I ask this every single episode, and I'm going to keep doing it, if you have not supported the Media Research Center yet, if you are not a financial supporter of the MRC, please, 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 mrc.org/donate. You can find out more information there. We are a 501c3 organization. That means we rely entirely on donor support. All of our content is free. We don't put up a paywall. We don't charge you anything for it. But if you like The Brittany Hughes Show, if you like other content of ours over at MRC TV, over at our sister site Newsbusters, please make sure that you are supporting us so that we can continue to do this and continue to provide this content for you. Also, make sure that you head over to Apple Podcasts, hit subscribe on The Brittany Hughes Show. That way you will never miss an episode. And while you're at it, subscribe to the Newsbusters podcast. That one is on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays with Tim Graham over at Newsbusters. He breaks down media bias like nobody else can. I promise you, you don't want to miss it. Thank you so much for joining me. That's The Brittany Hughes Show for today. Have a great weekend. I will see you back here next Thursday.